I am an only child who grew up on a farm in Washington State. We had neighboring farms and land around us, but from where our house was, we could only ever see one other neighbor. There was one gas station with a small convenience store up the road from us, but other than that, getting into town was about a 10-mile drive. Between the ages of 8 and 10 years old, I used to love playing outside with my dog and best friend Bailey more than anything. I also loved begging my parents to let me camp outside in a tent with him overnight, which they did let me do. When they first let me do it, my dad would stay with Bailey and me, but I wanted to camp out there so much in the summer months that he got tired of it, so they eventually let me do it alone. Even though I was really young, I still have the best memories of spending nights out in our backyard alone with Bailey, stargazing and flipping through Highlights magazine with a flashlight and falling asleep with him right next to me. I used to pretend that we were on these huge adventures miles out into the wilderness together, and it was just a really fun time in my life. During that time, I also have a memory of watching certain stars move in the most amazing ways. It didn't seem weird to me at all as a kid, but I remember watching single stars do tricks and make patterns in the sky. They would even come closer, then move farther away, and in my memories of it, it was a fun and playful thing, and it always seemed like they were putting on a private show just for me. This could have been the wild imagination of a young mind, but I do remember actually seeing it, and often, and I can even remember what they looked like. On one of our camping nights, I woke up and noticed Bailey wasn't next to me. He rarely left my side even during the day, and he had never taken off from the tent at night, so I knew something was wrong. Right away, I got up, unzipped the tent, and went out to look for him. What I didn't even think about at the time, and this is a very strange detail I didn't realize until later in my life, is that he had gotten out of a fully zipped up tent, which was still closed when I went out. When I was standing on the edge of our backyard, it only took me a minute to find him, and he was lying down alone under one of our big trees about 30 feet from the tent. I called his name several times, but he didn't move, which was way out of character for him. I remember getting the worst sick in my stomach feeling, thinking he was either injured or had died while I was asleep. I started walking over to him while still calling his name, and as I got closer, I realized there was a boy about my age kneeling down by his back legs, but this boy had been mostly behind the tree, so I couldn't see him until I had gotten closer. It did startle me a little to see him there, but I don't think I was really afraid. I was mostly worried about my dog. As soon as he made eye contact with me, he said, "Go, Bailey," and smacked him on his stomach. Bailey instantly jumped up and started barking at the kid like crazy. It wasn't like a bark from a car pulling up our driveway. It was like an actual scary intruder bark. I watched the boy take several steps backward, then he just started running away. I actually yelled out for him to come back because I thought he looked exactly like a kid from my school named Ryan. Whoever he was, though, he didn't look back once, and all of the barking and yelling had woken up my parents, who then came out and made me sleep inside. I told them exactly what had happened with Bailey and how I'd seen the kid from school, and I remember them not believing a word I was saying. They just sat me down and repeatedly asked me for the truth. As a kid, I didn't grasp how impossible it would have been for one of my classmates to be hanging out on our farm in the middle of the night and sitting with my unconscious dog under a tree. My parents weren't happy about it, and after that night, they stopped letting me camp outside. In my mind, that was all that ever happened, and my childhood went on like normal. What I didn't realize is there was a whole other part to the story that I didn't know until I was an adult. When I was in my 20s and in the middle of a totally unrelated conversation with my parents, that story happened to come up. Out of the blue, my mom reminded me that I had seen a counselor after that because I was having recurring dreams and sneaking out of the back door at night. I did vaguely remember going to a counselor for a short time, but I had no recollection at all of the dreams or sneaking out of the house at 10 years old. My parents remembered everything though, and they told me every detail. What they say is that I would have a dream, which I told them was the same every time. Then I would get up in the middle of the night to sneak outside and play with Ryan from school. My story was that Ryan and I would run out into the woods together to meet up with his brothers. I also told my mom that every one of his brothers looked exactly like him, which she says gave her chills when she heard it. I would talk about playing games in the trees with them and the adventures they would take me on, and even wrestling with them in our hayfield. I guess the hayfield was kind of a central place where I would meet with them and say goodbye to them, which is really odd when I think about it. I had no memory of any of it, so the therapy must have worked, but talking about it did spark a memory of something else. I really did know someone at school named Ryan, and we went to school together from elementary all the way through middle school. I remembered talking to him once about playing together and him being over at my house, but he told me he had never been to my house and that we had never done anything together. Back then, I just took it as him not wanting to hang out anymore, and I really didn't care or think much more about it than that. When I look back at the timeline, it seems like I had that actual conversation with Ryan at school right around the time I stopped seeing the counselor, and I guess my weird behaviors all stopped from what my parents tell me. Ryan became just another kid I'd see at school, but I never really talked to him again. In between middle school and high school, we moved to a different state because of my dad's job, and I never saw the real Ryan again. After learning the other half of the story from my parents, I really have no idea what was happening back then. I could totally believe I had an imaginary friend or was just dreaming all of it if it had happened when I was 3 or 4 years old, but not 10 going on 11. That was the age I was thinking about sports and starting to look at girls differently. I've always had a good imagination, but I'm not crazy. I do know the difference between reality and fantasy, and I know I did then too. One of these days, I'd really like to take a trip back to Washington and drive by our old house just to see if any other memories come up. I know my parents clearly remember everything, but now I'm very curious about it, and I'd like to remember it too. I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning to the sound of a thunderstorm. That alone was kind of unusual because we don't get that many thunderstorms where I live in the Portland area, especially not at night. As a storm lover, I was excited to hear thunder, and I got out of bed so I could watch the storm from my backyard. From the back of our house, we have a gorgeous, elevated, and very wide view that overlooks the Columbia River. On a clear day, I can see about 50 miles. There's also a well-established flight path that runs parallel to our view, with planes coming from and going to our international airport, PDX. Planes typically fly by at an altitude of around 500 feet and about 1 or 2 miles away from us. The approach path is highly predictable, especially at night or in bad weather, and the altitude, angle, and direction are all very consistent. I've been watching planes do this for years, and it's never changed. On this night, when I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the storm cloud, which was probably 5 to 10 miles away. It was massive and tall with frequent lightning, both within the cloud and branching out of it. The stars were still visible above our house and even above the cloud, and I could see that it was slowly drifting toward the hills across the river on the Washington side. As I was standing there, I saw a commercial aircraft approaching from the east and to my right, and it was heading west over the river, perfectly following the normal flight path. The plane maintained its typical descent profile, avoided the storm, and passed in front of me exactly as expected. It gradually descended and disappeared behind the trees and structures in the direction of the airport. Right around that same time, and I didn't know if this was some kind of shift or change in the storm, but the lightning stopped almost entirely and the sky seemed darker because of it. I could still make out the outline of the storm cloud because parts of it were being silhouetted by the city lights below and the stars up above it. Then I saw a second light appear. I couldn't really tell what it was, but something seemed off about it almost immediately. It only took me about 5 seconds to realize that feeling was correct. This light had come out from deep within the storm cloud, not from beneath it like it would have if it were another plane taking off, and it was moving in a straight line toward our house. It almost looked like one of the bright, forward-facing landing lights that planes will use occasionally, but there was only one of them, and if it was the landing light on a plane, something was clearly wrong. No plane should be emerging from a cloud like that, especially not at night and certainly not in the direction it was going. Planes don't approach the airport from over the hills across the river because the terrain is too high and the flight path never comes in from that angle. This light was also several thousand feet in the air. If I had to guess, I'd estimate it was between 3,000 and 5,000 feet up, which is far too high and off course for a landing approach. It wasn't until I went up on our back deck to get a slightly better view that I realized the light had completely stopped moving. I know it had been moving when it came out of the cloud, but then it had just stopped there, fixed in place. As I continued to watch while racking my brain to figure out what it was, I noticed there were no position lights anywhere on or around it. The flashing red and green beacons on the wings would have to have been there if it was a plane, but there was only the single solid white light. I stared at it for several minutes, expecting the object to either resolve itself into a plane or at the very least move its position, but it never did. Instead, the lights seemed to change very subtly in color. I can't confirm this because I was staring at it intensely, and I know your eyes can play tricks on you, but it appeared to me to change from the bright white color into a faint green, then into blue, and then back to white. It was also harder for my eyes to stay focused on it while it was doing that, and it reminded me of trying to look at something through a thick window. There was a kind of visual dissonance going on where my eyes felt like they were focused on the wrong layer. I kept expecting it to start descending or turning toward the airport, or really anything, but it still didn't move. Then it did something so completely unexpected that it physically took my breath away. I watched it reverse itself back into the cloud. It didn't turn around or fade out or have dark clouds move in front of it. It actually moved backward and slowly, and it even lit up part of the cloud around it as it re-entered the storm. As it moved back, the light gradually went out until it disappeared altogether. The strangest part, and something I had almost forgotten about, was immediately after the light was gone, the thunder and lightning started again. I could see the flashes in the cloud again, and several random bolts of lightning hit the ground. And while I stayed out there hoping to see something more, the storm continued drifting across the river and into Washington. Since that experience, I spend much more time watching for things out back than I used to. I also consider myself to be a very logical and analytical person, but I have no explanation for what I saw. I grew up in Ames, Iowa, and still live here today. Ames is a nice Midwestern college town surrounded by corn and soy fields in pretty much all directions. When I was a kid, I lived in town, but one of my best friends, Nick, lived on an 80-acre farm about 10 minutes away and outside of town. Their house sat closer to the road and had a big, newer barn next to it, and farther down by a pasture there was a second, older barn. The older barn was in rough shape, and they mostly used it for storing equipment like mowers, a tractor, and random junk. I used to love going to his house in the summer because there was so much room to mess around and do things, and he even had a quad that we would ride around on. I also loved how many stars you could see at night compared to my house in town. It just felt like a different world out there. One summer when we were 13, I was staying the night at his house. I can't remember the date, but it was either July or August. That night was very hot, and we decided to go outside really late with a bag of chips and some pop to play on his rope swing. His dad had strung up a huge swing from one of their bigger trees on the side yard with ropes that had to be 20 or 30 feet up. You could get some serious height on it, and it was even more fun at night. While we were out there talking and doing whatever, we both noticed something down the hill at the older barn. There were these small balls of light that looked exactly like glowing basketballs, and they were moving around right at the roof level of the barn, and we could not figure out what they were. We stared at them for a minute, then I was the one who noticed there were more of them, but they were up higher in the sky above the barn. I don't know how high they were, but it looked like hundreds of feet up or more to me back then. There had to be a dozen of them in total, and they weren't doing anything but floating around. Some were moving slowly, and other ones were just still and in one place. Drones didn't exist back then, so it wasn't anything like that, but we were thinking balloons, and Nick said we needed to walk down to the barn to see what they were. As we walked down the path toward his back field, there was a split rail fence that separated the main yard from the rest of the property, and the barn was right at the end of it. When we got closer to the fence, the weirdest thing started happening. Everything was getting noticeably quieter. I don't mean that the actual sounds around us got quieter. It was more like if you had earplugs in your ears and kept slowly pushing them in farther and farther, where it almost feels like the pressure and hearing loss when you go underwater. I remember staring at the lights and being so confused. Then on top of that, it felt like we were walking into some kind of bubble where everything was muffled, and I kept opening my mouth really wide to try and pop my ears. Nick and I both experienced this too. By the time we got to the fence and had our arms on the top rail, it was almost completely silent. The two of us stood there for a few seconds, totally mesmerized and watching these things that really did look like glow-in-the-dark balloons as they floated around the barn right in front of us. Then, I swear to God, we started to hear what sounded like people whispering. It wasn't just one voice, but a bunch of them, and it sounded like it was all around us. This is when I think we both knew something was wrong, and I personally felt like we weren't supposed to be hearing these things. I looked over at Nick and he was looking right at me, and in a fraction of a second we turned away from the barn and ran as fast as we could back up the hill, across his yard and straight into the house without even looking behind us. We went straight into his room and shut the door, and if I remember right, we tried to play Battleship to distract ourselves. I barely remember that part though. I do remember actually starting to laugh about it like it was funny, but it really wasn't. I was pretending not to be as scared as I was, which I think Nick was doing too, and I really didn't sleep well that night. We also never told his parents about any of it. In the morning, we woke up way earlier than we normally would because his dad was talking loudly in the kitchen, and we heard him saying something about the cows getting out. When we got up and went out into the living room, his parents were still talking, and I guess their cows had managed to break part of their fencing down, and his dad had found every one of them gathered around the old barn. Hearing that the cows did that really scared me, and it also solidified that what we had seen was real. Cows wouldn't just do that for no reason. Neither one of us said anything about it to his parents, and all I remember doing was eating breakfast and waiting for my mom to pick me up. Nick and I have talked about this a million times, but for whatever reason, I've always gotten the feeling that he doesn't feel comfortable telling his parents something like that, so as far as I know, they still have no idea it happened. Ever since then, it's just been this weird memory and experience that we had together, and it's one that only we really know about. Whatever we walked into around his barn was not normal, and I remember looking at it differently after that. Even as we got older and into our late teens, we would joke about it, but in a half-serious way. Who knows what was actually out there or what it was that we saw? I couldn't even come up with an answer if you paid me, because it was just so weird.